you able to see the PowerPoint? Is it full screen, Teresa, PowerPoint, or?
It's not full screen yet.
It was fleetingly full screen, but it isn't now.
Just try to. Okay, so
that's it.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, all of you, other speakers. So I'm going to take about 15 to 20 minutes to share some of the findings from our research that Patricia has already introduced. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about just a couple of findings, give you some sort of a little more details on the study that we conducted in India, followed by focusing on two key findings. As Teresa has already mentioned, this research was funded by Beacon Social Research Council and ICSSR, called for Collaborative Research and Urban Transformation. University of Delhi in India, Northeast Network in Guwahati, and us in Edinburgh, but also now that Anus moved, University of Essex are all partners in this study. So what we did was, this is a 2-year study. We conducted field work between the 2018 summer of 2018 and 2019, late 2019 in Guwahati and Jalandhar. So just to give you an overview of the study, so we focused our study on a broad set of themes to examine the lives of low-income migrants in two of the fastest growing tier 2 cities. We did not want to focus on big cities, as Chris has already mentioned. There has been quite a lot of studies on focusing on big cities, but also there are some analytical reasons why we chose to focus on smaller or tier 2, we may call them, or tier 3 cities, simply because first of all, we don't know enough about what's going on there, but also there are not many. That was our hypothesis, and partly remains one of our findings, although things are different in Guwahati than in Jalandhar. The presence of civil society organizations or NGOs are quite different in these tier 2, tier 3 cities than, say, in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, where issues of urban poverty or migrants, from housing perspective, from work perspective, have been debated much more than, say, in these smaller cities. So our study focused on migrant journeys, their relationship to the city, access to healthcare, and basic services, as well as experiences of exposure to violence and ill treatment in the city, as well as their justice-seeking mechanism. So what we did was, for this study, we did not focus on a particular group of low-income migrants in these cities. I'll come to that a little bit, why it does not probably make sense for us to focus on a particular group. Instead, why we decided to start by mapping low-income migrants in these two cities. We did a quantitative survey. I put the number there. We did, followed by, so this is done in sequence. So we did mapping. Then we did a quantitative survey. Through that, we recruited participants for in-depth interviews in each of these two cities, and we also did photo voice sessions with groups of migrants in each of these cities. So I must say that I must acknowledge the work done by Anurag, Sharma, Parthi Kumari, and the researchers based at Northeast Network. Without whose support, this would not have been possible for us to do so much of so many of these surveys and interviews. So what I'm going to present today it has recently been published in the journal Society and Culture of South Asia. So I'm basically going to speak from that paper, but also highlight a couple of other points. So for those of you who do not know these two cities, there are some facts. So I'm not going to read out each of these in details, but there you go. I think a few things to point is these are two cities roughly the same size, as you can see. Statistically speaking, in Jalandhar there is a figure for this is taken from the municipality there. Roughly 25% are migrant workers in the city. That figure is not available for Guwahati, which I think is very interesting in itself, because the question of who is a migrant and who is not has remained a very contentious issue and methodologically quite a challenging issue. We read reports and so on saying, well, but how do you know? It's not written on the forehead, right? Who is a migrant? And that became much more contentious in Guwahati for obvious reasons to do with NRC. So the other point I think it's very interesting for us to point is, unlike in Guwahati, in Jalandhar, we did not observe in the public sphere. We did a bit of mapping of newspapers and the public debate in these two cities. There's no violent backlash against apologies for too violent there against incoming migrant workers in Jalandhar. So very different. Obviously Jalandhar, as you can see, large number of migrant workers work in factories, long history of leather factories, but also other forms of sports and other goods. So large number of our participants came from those groups who work inside factories or work at home, doing piece rate work. In Guwahati, large number of our participants were construction workers, reflecting the fact that Guwahati has been booming with construction. Everywhere you go in Guwahati, there's a booming construction. sector. Factory work was there, but was very limited. So our participants do not necessarily come from factories in Guwahati. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is to give you a very brief sort of snapshot of the two cities that we focus this study on, some differences there. One more point is, why did we not say focus on domestic workers or just construction workers or just another set of migrant workers by work category, or why did we not focus on say one particular neighborhood, one particular slum or one particular ward? There are good reasons for that, I think, which is partly for the former. We found that it's very difficult to categorize a low-income migrant worker within a certain work identity. You're a construction worker for a few weeks, few months. You may not be a construction worker after that time. We may find that in research reports, in policy documents. The law, the USW Act, for instance. But in real life, what we found was people's lives are quite fluid. They move in and out of jobs, in and out of. Sometimes you're a domestic worker maybe for some time. You may be doing some other odd job. So it's very, for that reason, we thought that it's useful to start with a very open sort of category. The other point is, why did we not choose, say, to start with as typical studies on urban migrants would do, say, focus on a slum? Well, I think there's an interesting category here. People who are not, cannot locate them in a place like a slum. People who may not necessarily have a place to stay or have an address, a fixed residence. People may stay for a few months in one place, then may move their place of residence and work, as I indicated, to somewhere else. So if you focus on a specific residential, area, we don't necessarily get to capture that. And I think what is interesting here is people don't even have that sort of fixed place of residence. So this is the sort of group we are talking about that we may miss out if we just focus on, say, a slum or a particular neighborhood. The other point is, in these two cities, what is different about these two cities is that there's no sort of, unlike Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta, like these big metros, there's no slum like sort of shanty towns, that kind of settlement. So where do migrants actually live? Their residence. I'm not going to focus on that, but that's a paper in itself. That's a presentation in itself. It's largely provided by private landlords, having small, what we call rooming houses, made for housing low-income housing made for low-income migrants, in the sense that with slightly substandard sort of housing, collective spaces in the courtyard. We can talk about that if there are questions. I'm not going to focus on that, but that's also something really interesting that we observed in our study. Okay. So two findings or two arguments, I guess. The first one is, which is inspired by widespread coverage in Indian media on the return of migrant workers, back home. In the international media, in the local Indian media, both Hindi and English medium newspapers, we saw this sort of exodus of people trying to reach home, walking, stranded in transport hubs and so on. I think we wanted to complicate based on our research findings, although we did not conduct our research after the coronavirus pandemic. Our researchers were on the ground, and we were able to speak to some of the participants we spoke to. So we wanted to kind of put forward this point, which is well known in the migration scholarship. I think this is very important that we reinforce this point, that migrant workers' decision to return home is not simply a result of, say, outbreak like coronavirus or any other sort of major incidents. We have to historically sort of situate their mobility. That's an extension of what we are calling precarity, that originate from their rural base, where they come from. So that's point one, that we found that many of the low-income migrants that we spoke to did not return back home, where actually we could call it stranded or decided to stay behind. The second point is partly inspired by our engagement on this concept of precarity, which has been used largely in the neoliberal sort of context in neoliberal cities, largely in the northern countries, but now it's widespread in its use in southern countries, like in India as well. Precarity has been used, but we thought that concept of precarity has been largely used within the economic sort of sphere, within the context of work. But we think it's very useful to talk about precarity beyond work as well, because thinking about various forms of vulnerability that emanate not just from work and the nature of work that we are talking about, but also in terms of the everyday forms of exposure to ill treatment and access to sort of intermittent access to services. I would say they're not completely restricted from certain services, but there is this intermittent access to various public services and limited protection that we see. So precarity therefore emanates not just from work in the city; is very much linked to where they come from, but also how it gets reinforced through various forms of ill treatment that they find themselves exposed to with limited access to justice in the cities. So just a few numbers, and I'll come back to why I'm sharing some of these numbers. We're still sort of working through our data, but here. So in Jalandhar, out of 180 have been coming to the city for the last more than 10 years. In Guwahati, 101 out of 126, more than 10 years. So what we're saying is people have been coming to the city for a very long time, right? So it's not like people have just come to the city. Large number of people have just come to the city in recent years. They do go back to their villages. As we can see, quite visited in Jalandhar, 66 out of 100 visited once or twice. In Guwahati, 60 visited more than 3 times. So I guess what you're saying is their connection to their village is pretty strong. They do go back. It's a part of their life that coming and going. So it's not that coronavirus happens and then only when then you go back home. Likewise, in Guwahati, we found that 46 migrants spoke to had out of 126 had families with them, and in Jalandhar, 59. So often we imagine migrants to be these individuals, working in these various work settings. What we found was, a good number of migrants bring their families. So, returning home is not going to be that easy when you have families, schools. You may have paid your rent for several months in advance. So it's not like, suddenly people are going to just make decisions to return. Okay, so how am I doing with time, Teresa?
Sorry, I had to unmute. I think you've got another maximum 7-8 minutes, absolute maximum.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. So I think the point I've already made is, migrants come to the city to earn and go back home when they can't find work or when they fall seriously ill, when they are needed back home. So circulation is very much a part of their, migration sort of strategy in that sense. But home visits need to be planned. You can't just instantly decide to return. I think there was a quote, I put it there, I'm not going to read out, but it tells us something, really interesting about this guy was, he told us that, you can't just go home, without earning some money, which is the reason why he was there, Okay, I'm not going to talk about access to healthcare. I'm straight focusing on widespread ill treatment that I talked about. Let me give you some facts here from our survey. 76 migrants in Guwahati out of 126 they do not feel safe in the city. In Jalandhar, 19 out of 100 said they do not feel safe. I think the number is different, but nonetheless, I think still it's very, very high. Even 90 is very high when you talk about, in Guwahati as well. So despite this, there are a large number of migrant workers living and working in the city, but they do not feel safe. So that has bearing on your everyday life in the city when you move around, where you live, when you go to work. 89 out of 126 say that they've been ill-treated, and I've got the number there for Jalandhar. And what we found was, they do not report instances of abuse and ill-treatment to the police. So this goes unnoticed in that sense. It's an everyday sort of, forms of ill-treatment. You were ill-treated on the way to work, at work, in your residence. So it's a very mundane sort of everyday sort of aspect of your life. And migrants are highly racialized, calling Paya, Payani, Mia, Miani, which is very much rooted in the racialized identity of these migrants, who they are, where they come from. And the ill treatment often emanating from those, and workspaces are also sort of highly shaped by some of these ethnic identities as well. I think this is if we think about putting these findings in the broader sort of perspectives, dealing with on human rights documents and reports, this is serious. Incidents of ill treatment of this nature ought to be a serious concern, but somehow goes unnoticed, or somehow has been sort of normalized in the sense that this is how it is. People don't even think that this is unacceptable. So just a few points in conclusion. So discourses of migrant workers returning home, or what was called a reverse migration, does not seem to be supported by evidence. So migrant workers have returned back to the cities, as we know, following the pandemic, suggesting that there was no dent made by the pandemic on the systems of circulatory labor. So there's no question of reverse migration, or what's going to happen to these cities when migrants decide not to come. I think what we've seen is things have gone back, people have returned. So there was a moment of, I'm sure Mukta and Divya may have more to say on this. I think there was a moment of outstanding visibility, partly because media coverage was quite heavy, bringing the plight of migrant workers into the public sphere, exposing the broken system of exclusionary citizenship and the work of activists and so on in the Indian public sphere. The question is, has this possibility been lost, or is there still some sort of possibility of using pandemic as a background to push this inclusionary sort of citizenship forward? The other point is migrant workers' precarity, as I mentioned earlier, do not just emanate from neoliberal economic policies, because the kind of work these migrant workers are doing in these two cities is not it's not just neoliberal in that sense. It's in some sense semi-feudal as well. So it's, I guess what we're trying to say here is that precarity is not a neoliberal only phenomenon. It is very much a phenomenon that is rooted in the broader political economy of circulatory labor migration, but also the nature of these cities and how they have evolved that pushes migrant workers into this racialized ill treatment on an everyday basis. Finally, I think while the attention has been in the last year or so on the exodus, we also need to understand those migrant workers, those who stayed back behind in the cities, those who decided or were forced to stay back in the cities, and perhaps the displacement of livelihoods for them in the city, as opposed to being displaced from the city. So perhaps people were forced to, stay behind in the city. I think we really need to understand those who decided or were forced to stay behind in the city during the pandemic. And I think that has significant learning in terms of expanding social protection architecture for migrant workers. Thank you. Lisa, that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeevan. Now, Divya, I hope, is able to speak to us. And Victor, have you got her PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Good.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Fingers crossed. I'm having a really difficult day today with my laptop and my broadband, but I'm going to launch right into it and pray for the best. Sekta, if you could just share my presentation. So just to sort of have a started off, the organization that I work with is Aajeevika Bureau, and we are a specialized kind of public service organization that works in the Western Migration Corridor. So we are headquartered in Rajasthan, which is a major sending state. It's a predominantly tribal region, the southern parts of Rajasthan, and it sends migrant workers in great numbers to the more sort of commercial business cities like Ahmedabad, Surat, and Mumbai in Maharashtra and Gujarat. And so we work with migrant workers and their families through migration resource centers, migrant facilitation centers at both rural end as well as the urban end, as well as in the cities. And we provide a range of services for them. We mobilize them into community institutions and trade unions and support them in activating government systems and demanding entitlements from the state as well as the employers. So that's sort of the broad kind of work that Aajeevika Bureau does. We also run a specialized kind of policy advocacy and research unit. And the presentation that I'm going to be focusing on today is actually drawn from a report that we recently released in collaboration with ILO's migration desk as part of their recent work team, as well as the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development, which is another civil society organization based in Kerala. So we have tried to bring together sort of pan-India perspectives from a policy kind of a viewpoint. Of course, Jeevan has really given a very rich characterization of migrant workers in the urban labor markets, and a lot of my context-based slides that I had in the beginning are really very, very similar to that. So maybe we can start with the first slide, and then I can give you a cue to move forward. The next one, please. Yeah, so just to set a broad sort of context, there is rising rural deprivation and simultaneously increasing pace of urbanization that's really driving labor mobility today in India. A lot of the migration that Aajeevika Bureau deals with, and also that is very, very vulnerable in nature, is predominantly seasonal and cyclical. Like Jeevan was talking about, the movement is very circulatory. And interestingly, this has really become the principal and preferred means of labor recruitment in the country today. So whenever a decision is being made on whether an industry could be set up in a particular area, the availability of local labor is no longer a consideration, because it is always assumed that labor can come in through contractors or through social networks from other more impoverished parts of the country. And of course, what we see in migration and especially in the very bottom ends of major sort of sectors today is labor in its very, very casualized and commoditized form with no real access to entitlements and social protection. Next slide, please. The major sort of work sectors that employ migrant workers in great numbers are construction, and this is again old data, and this is one of the points that I would focus on later in my presentation, is the absence of recent data and enumeration at the national level. So this is again from a paper that Aajeevika wrote way back in 2009, which says that they estimate the total number of migrant workers in the country to be about 100 million, with construction being the biggest employer, followed by domestic work, textile industry, brick kilns, which see a lot of family migration into very vulnerable kind of work conditions, mines and quarrying, small manufacturing, recycling, agriculture, labor, especially between Bihar and Punjab. Head loading means carrying sacks, big sacks on your back or on your head in large sort of grain markets or vegetable markets, fruit markets in cities, and of course hotels, dhabas, and restaurants, right from roadside sort of hotels to big ones, and especially the sector employs child labor in very large numbers. Yeah, next one, please. So we see that a lot of this migration, especially into the very bottom end, is short-term, circular in nature. And according to many reports, there is an overrepresentation of Adivasis, Dalits, and other disadvantaged communities in this sort of migratory movement. About 42% of migrants come from SC and ST communities with very low levels of education and asset ownership back in the villages. And about 54% of them are in the bottom two consumption expenditure quintiles, which means very, very poor communities undertake this migration because of huge distress in the rural areas. Yeah, next one, please. So if we were to locate migration into a theoretical framework, locate the vulnerabilities faced by migrants, it really lies at the intersection and interaction of two phenomena, which is both mobility as well as the informal work conditions that migrants experience in their urban sort of destinations. So there are, of course, if we were to examine the factor of mobility, there are prominent migration corridors which are established, which are newly emergent. Interstate migration, of course, leads to severe vulnerabilities, but there is also a vast majority of migrants who are intrastate, who move within state borders, and their vulnerabilities are also just as serious. Undocumented movements and recruitments happen in large numbers because they're mostly in the informal work environments with no work contracts, no specific terms and conditions of work are agreed upon in advance. So all of it is driven by oral sort of work contracts. Urban exclusion is, of course, very stark, and Mukta, I think, we'll talk about it in more detail. And recruitment usually happens through a long chain of contractors and middlemen who are sort of sourcing labor from the villages and bringing them to the cities. And this really engenders a large range of vulnerable movements, which ranges from seasonal and circular to long distance, single male and family based, distress driven, that often leads to forms of forced labor and modern forms of slavery and bondage. Next one, please. So these are some of the issues. I think Jeevan has touched upon them quite a lot, so I will just go through them really quickly. They are very invisible. Fragmentation, especially because of the informality, is very, very prominent. Fragmentation in the sense that these are big brands actually outsource smaller chunks of work to more micro kind of enterprises which employ migrant workers in large numbers. They work there in very precarious kind of work conditions with grave risks to their occupational health and safety. They're cut out from the ambit of provident funds or ESI or any kind of social protection health insurance, which really became very visible during the lockdown. When many of them were outside even PDS systems, they did not have access to ration supplies. Even in the so wage frauds and non-payment of wages is very rampant because of the informality. But there is almost no recourse to legal aid in the event of fraud or abuse. There's in general a weak enforcement of workers' rights and entitlements. The Labour Department itself is very disempowered and under-resourced, so its ability to enforce any kind of labour protection agenda is very limited. There's of course huge kind of burdens that women migrant workers have to undertake because they have to reproduce their households in very frugal conditions. Especially as they move from one work site to another, and they're themselves participating in the labor markets as workers and really shoulder multiple responsibilities, both with respect to their occupation as well as with respect to their reproductive kind of responsibilities. And there's always an intergenerational transmission of poverty because children are really at the receiving end of this kind of chain because they get cut off from education or early childcare, which really then has a big impact on their outcomes in terms of health and intellectual development. Next one, please. I think Mukta will talk about this in greater detail in her presentation, but I just want to say that migrants are really absent from the urban policy imagination in India today, especially with regard to their mobility and seasonality, because entitlements are always linked to a domicile and being able to constantly furnish room for residents in a particular area. So they are easily kind of pushed out of the ambit of many entitlements, and even to access basic urban provisioning like water and sanitation, they have to rely on informal networks in their kind of living areas. A lot of them live inside work sites. That's the second photo there in the power rooms of Surat, for example. About 70 to 100 workers sleep in that one room, which is called a mess hall. And the implications of that, especially during the corona time, one can just imagine. And a lot of them also live in open settlements, which are neither recognized nor enumerated by the municipal corporation. Next one, please. There are a lot of fault lines very systemic in nature. So a lot of the vulnerabilities and distress that we saw during Corona was as a result of pre-existing, long-standing kind of systemic issues that only just got exaggerated and compounded during the lockdown. For example, lack of enumeration, right from the census and the national sample survey at the national level, migrants are really excluded from all forms of enumeration, be it at the state level or the district level, both in terms of the sending regions as well as the receiving regions. Like I said earlier, there is a sedentary bias in these social policies because there is a limited portability of social rights, especially with regard to housing, public healthcare, and PDS. If we look at the labor side of things, the labor regulations in India, the regulatory environment has been revamped quite a lot very recently, so that has really kind of changed the legal landscape with respect to the rights of migrant workers and also informal workers in general. So the Interstate Migrant Workers Workmen Act, which was a single piece of existing legislation with regard to migrant workers, has now been subsumed into the Occupational Safety and Health Code. But there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding the policy landscape with regard to labor right now because the state level rules are yet to be formulated. So it's still very unclear in what direction it is going to be. And there's a lot of dichotomy between the urban governance and the labor governance systems because it's not very clear who is really responsible for providing basic urban provisioning to the workers. Is it the employer or is it the municipal corporation? So the employers and the municipal authorities really pass the buck from one side to another, and migrants really fall through the cracks. I would now like to just go to the whole policy roadmap part of my presentation. And this, I said, is drawn from a report that we authored very recently. The next slide, please. So this is based on a few principles on the basis of which we try to put forth a new policy vision for migrant workers. So it starts with sort of addressing informality and moving towards kind of formalization, especially with regards to recruitment, with respect to work contracts, with respect to including migrant workers in employment-related entitlements, and especially kind of focusing on workers which are invisible. For example, workers who are self-employed, who are home-based workers, who work on a piece rate basis. In these cases, the relationship with the principal employer is not very clear. So especially focusing on such groups, ensuring continuous access to justice, so that and treating that as an inalienable right, so that violation of any kind of labor rights, especially with regards to wages, with regard to safety, all of these can be demanded. Moving towards a universal social protection system, that is not tied to domicile or employment status or length of tenure in the city, especially in the realms of subsidized food, healthcare, employment protection, and early childcare, guaranteeing dignified, safe, and healthy living and working conditions. So there has to be a separation between the work site as well as the housing situation of migrant workers, and all of this. And I mean, the government of India has started talking about large-scale rental housing, but we really have to see the direction that it is taking. But ensuring dignity in this is imperative. And lastly, I think enabling workers' collectivization and organization in terms of facilitating social dialogue, tripartism, ensuring that different stakeholders can come onto one platform and have a dialogue with each other in terms of policy formulation. These are sort of the policy visions, and I would just briefly touch upon our recommendations to individual kind of stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the various sort of stakeholders that we've kind of mapped out, there are more in the report itself, but for the purpose of this presentation, it's really the government of India, sending regions, including both the sending states as well as the Panchayati Raj institutions, receiving regions in the form of states as well as the urban local bodies, employers as well as the trade unions. Next one, please. So starting with the government of India, I think the first and foremost call is to bridge the evidence and enumeration gap, and make sure that migration is characterized and accounted for in the large-scale national level data collection exercises in a way that it also is able to capture the various heterogeneities involved in migration in terms of work arrangements, in terms of seasonalities, migration patterns, regional differences, gender and social identities involved. So all of these heterogeneities will need to be incorporated into this enumeration. Fortifying investments in rural development, especially in terms of having alternate livelihood choices, revamping agriculture, strengthening health and education infrastructure, so that migration is a safe and informed choice, so that they have a bargaining power with respect to negotiating their work conditions with contractors. Constituting an empowered nodal agency within the Ministry of Labour and Employment that can really act as a body to converge all kinds of social security schemes, portability of entitlements, provide recommendations to key migrant employing industries. So having an empowered nodal agency within the ministry that solely focuses on migrant workers. Strengthening labour administration through budgeting and provision of resources, and inclusion of migrants in India's urban policy formulation and imagination, and restructuring industrial policy to provide special impetus to micro enterprises. Because in our work, we've seen that it's really the very, very tiny micro kind of enterprises that employ migrant workers, especially the vulnerable ones, on a very large scale. But in India's industrial policy, there's no differentiation that is made between micro enterprises and the small and medium enterprises. And there are all these matters of legal thresholds due to which migrants fall out of the ambit of a vast number of labor entitlements. So restructuring industrial policy in a way that micro enterprises have special impetus to provide occupational safety and minimum wages to their employees. Next one, please. So the next set of recommendations is to the sending regions and Panchayati Raj institutions in terms of mapping and prioritizing high out-migration areas so that targeted interventions can be made for them. Also to the families who choose to stay behind and ensure their access to various kind of entitlements in the source regions. Establishing facilitation centers in high out-migration areas so that they can undertake pre-departure counseling, provide them with information, job referrals, investing in skill training of migrants so that once they are at the destination, they can access higher levels in the value chain. Providing easy access to financial services so that there is some kind of escape from the debt bondage that a lot of migrant workers have to undergo. Coordinating and establishing linkages with receiving regions. There are many established corridors in India, and building that kind of a synergy between sending and receiving regions can really provide a concerted kind of a welfare model for migrant workers. Next one, please. In terms of the receiving regions, that is the states as well as the urban local bodies, the imperative is to ensure enumeration of migrant workers, especially inside work sites in open settlements, so that the municipal corporations can also undertake appropriate planning and budgeting in their programs to ensure public provisioning for them. Again, setting up facilitation centers, migrant inclusive legal redressal mechanisms, which also accepts informal work arrangements and are able to solve for issues arising in the course of informal work arrangements. Focusing on gender-specific needs of migrant workers, especially in terms of the sexual harassment that they undergo at work sites and living areas, preventing child labour and ensuring continuation of education for children of migrant workers. Next one, please. This is like the last slide in terms of the recommendations to both employers. Okay, this one is about employers in terms of accessing, ensuring that there is a transparency in the value chain, that they are able to ensure a move towards formalization, influencing investors by making it mandatory on investors to demand ethical kind of practices of industries that they are investing in, promoting social dialogue, ensuring representation of migrant workers in these platforms of tripartism, and taking responsibility really for the most vulnerable of workers at the bottom ends of the supply chain, like the home-based workers, like the self-employed workers, and those that are working on piece rate basis. Yeah, next one, please. Right now, there's a big vacuum in terms of inclusion of migrant workers in India's most prominent trade unions. So mainstreaming the organizing of migrant workers, eliminating discrimination between local and migrant workers, especially in terms of wage rates, that creates a lot of fractures within the labor workforce in a city. And going beyond just the function of wage negotiation, but also bargaining for standards on occupational safety and health, building awareness and mobilizing migrants in a way and empowering them in a way that they are able to really effectively participate in these tripartite platforms for bargaining. And lastly, on account of the alienation that migrant workers face in urban areas, really the trade unions have to develop themselves into a platform where they can also focus on the emotional and socio-cultural needs of these workers. Yeah, last one. So in conclusion, I think I just want to say that in a world that is really increasingly shaped by migration and movement, full economic citizenship that is enabled by both social and political right needs to be cast as a fundamental human right in today's world. And with private capital playing so much of a central role in triggering movement, ensuring accountability from the side of industry is really imperative. And of course, migrants' own agency and voice has to be central in claiming citizenship rights. Yeah, I'll stop there, and I hope I haven't exceeded time. Thank you.
No, thanks very much indeed. You kept excellently to time, and thank goodness the technology let us down at the last moment. Good. Thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting indeed. Let's move straight on to the final presentation, which is going to be by Mukta Naik, who I hope is still there somewhere. Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, should I start?
Yes, please do. And you've got a PowerPoint to
I do. I will share it on my own. I just wanted to say that it's a real privilege to be here. I think the last we met was in July 2018 when you were sort of consulting just ahead of going to field and actually operationalizing your project. It was also during the time that I was collecting data into non-metro cities as well. So I think there's a lot, and at another point we can discuss, other things that we can perhaps say to each other from what we found. But I'm hoping that what I'm going to share today, the thoughts I'm going to share today are somewhat complementary to what both Jeevan and Divya have said. And I've been thinking a lot about this. I'm an urban planner by training and have found myself into migration studies by a series of happy accidents. So it's always at the back of my mind that, cities in India are really not in a very good position to do much about anything, and least of all about migrants. And it's always laid at the door of the 74th Amendment and lack of, autonomy. But there has to be something more than that. And so just sort of to bolster what Jeevan's already said, that it's not just the largest cities, but actually the tier below, the medium-sized cities that are actually attracting more migrants, if you compare the two censuses, 2001 and 11. And also there has been a talk about how there are more women, coming to cities. And these are often, Divya's already pointed out, ignored and not brought out enough because the data is so poorly sort of collected and so delayed in its release. We still don't have full access to the 2011 census data. So it's really not a surprise that when the pandemic hit, when I say we, I mean the larger, thinking public and the larger bureaucratic setup and administrative setup that was, implementing the lockdown and looking at it very much from a perspective of disease control, really did not know what hit them. And we're all familiar with these visuals of hunger and of, people walking and we've already discussed, and police brutality and all of that sort of the experience that congealed. And I'd have to agree with both Jeevan and Divya here that there was an element of agency in this walking, even as there was job loss and extreme, uncertainty about the future. But there were some people who could walk home because they had a home somewhere else to walk back to. And there were others, urban poor, who were not migrants or who had lost that link with their villages over a period of time, who were in a different kind of situation. And of course, migrants who were literally stranded and forced to stay there. And I have to say also that the policy impetus at that time was to keep migrants in cities, and that's what district administrators were asked explicitly to do by the central government. And we have to remember that the lockdown was implemented under a National Disaster Management Act, which meant that it wasn't elected governments, but actually administrators who were working in an extremely top-down decision fashion at that time. So with that sort of context, okay. So there were a number of things that cities could not do. They couldn't quantify, they couldn't spatially locate where cities were, and they didn't have ready means to reach out to migrants because they had to depend on local and embedded networks to do so. The traditional channels, as Divya has already explained, employers and contractors, couldn't be held accountable because of the informalization. And so there was a lot of innovation that happened on the ground, a lot of failures, but also little attempts to universalize certain services like the PDS through emergency kind of windows or directed outreach in collaboration with civil society. I'm here referring to Jeevan's comments on on that moment of opportunity and what happened. And it obviously wasn't enough, but something did happen because there was so much of, even volunteerism and sort of even in sort of an emotional upsurge from elite citizens in cities to say that something has to be done. So I live and work in Gurugram, which is just south of Delhi, and having been embroiled in civil society networks during that time, I can say that the administration was highly pressurized by elite citizens of the city who were themselves shocked by how invisible migrants had been to them up until now. And we can, of course, argue that it's all gone back to square one, but I think there was that moment and that perhaps can still be leveraged. So I won't repeat much of this, but essentially the informality of work and housing that goes hand in hand is what shapes the precarious lives of migrants in cities. And already migrants are taking on the dirty, dangerous, demeaning jobs and living in dirty, dangerous, demeaning housing. And combined with the limits of the social safety net, there's really not much going for them, even ordinarily with or without the coronavirus. But they're still carrying on because there's an economic relationship that they have with the city. I think what was striking was the invisibility of migrants in the registers of the state, not just databases like BOCW registrations, and I'll come back to this, but also all sorts of IDs and the capacities of the local states to enumerate. And what I found really interesting was that when you look at the very local level, and when I'm talking today, I'm really thinking of a city level. I'm scaling this down to the city. I'm thinking as an actor working within the framework of a city, not the national, not the state at present. And it's really interesting that different wings of the city state have actually different kinds of registers. For example, the police station has some sort of a register of police verification, many of whom are migrant renters in informal sector housing. And especially in cities like Gurugram, which are close to metros, it's become quite common for landlords to get these police verification done, even though the rents themselves are only orally negotiated. So it's interesting that there isn't a formal record of the tenancy, but there is a formal record of that person being verified by a landlord for the purposes of housing, or being verified by an employer for the purposes of working in their home for domestic help, for instance. So there are these different registers which themselves are at different levels of formalization in the system of the state, and this also is something that has not come together, and that there's not much for conversation about bringing them together. Primary healthcare centers maintain lists of immunization. In some cities at least, there is inclusion of migrant children in immunization lists, but they may not exist in other kinds of lists. So all of these kind of discrepancies that perhaps can be sorted out. I'll go back a little bit to my own research, and I think this just sort of reinforces what Jeevan has already presented through the research in Jalandhar and Guwahati. I think urban footholds have always been difficult, and they've always been contingent, and they've always been negotiated. So migrants have to leverage social networks to gain employment, housing, and services. They have to negotiate with very powerful actors. They could be slumlords, they could be landlords, they could be employers, they could be all those labor intermediaries, tikidars, they could be local politicians. My own work on informal rental housing actually shows that that migrants share a fairly complex relationship with landlords, and even though it's a very unequal power relationship, migrants too use those flexible oral rental agreements to move through the city to maximize their savings. There are many instances of ordinary acts of resistance, like girls from the northeast living in urban villages in Gurgaon, which are extremely patriarchal, conservative villages, who will be undaunted in wearing what they want to wear, and who will be undaunted in occupying public spaces to make certain kinds of statements. There's also a lot of examples of using landlords actually as those footholds to integrate and to move sort of up the value chain of the city. But of course, this happens over a period of time, and that's why my question in the box, Jeevan, to you about if there's a correlation between how long they're there and them getting their families, and so sort of that life cycle kind of thinking here. Labor market, of course, Divya has already mentioned this. I worked in Kishangarh and Mangalore. So Kishangarh's in Rajasthan, Mangalore's down in coastal Karnataka, and clearly, and we all know that labor markets are segmented. Low-skilled migrants are concentrated in poorly paid informal work jobs, and formal-skilled jobs go to locals. This is what we found. And even if the wage differentials are not very high, there are other kinds of differentials, the kind of housing they can access, the kind of contracts they have, etc., which then have an impact on whether they can collectivize and whether they can demand certain kinds of rights. And what we found was that identity factors, especially caste and religion, played a huge role in the migration, more than the migration status, whether you're a migrant or a non-migrant. It's what your caste position is that might play a higher role. So if I'm a migrant and I'm an OBC, I might actually be less disadvantaged than a non-migrant who is, a Dalit. So there are all of these sort of factors that also, what I'm trying to say, that the status of the migrant needs to be seen layered over all of these, and migrants need to be seen as a social category in addition to all of these other social categories. So just to say where I did my research, this is the field site that I've been following for many years now, and you can see on the top left there's a swank 8-story building which now has service apartments, and this is a village where there were just shanty shacks for rentals till 10 years ago. So in 10 years it's transformed already. So this is the kind of sort of rebuilding and constant reconfiguring of these spaces that is happening in response to the kind of migration that's coming into the city. So same as what you were saying. Housing produced specifically for migrants, but as the city transforms and actually, the kind of people coming in transform, these spaces also change. And in fact, now entry-level migrants they're not able to afford housing in places as good as this. They really have to go into much more precarious, like slum shanties inside forest areas, and places that can be evicted very, very easily, etc. I wanted to come to sort of a few frameworks here, just to go into my sort of wear a governance hat here and say that, we all know that there is a constitutional framework under which migration is formally seen in the legal parlance of India. But there are pragmatic issues within India's federal structure. There was already referred to domicile, which impacts everything, especially public employment, higher education, service provision. And then there is the question of how do we include temporary residents for the purpose of social protection programs? And do we make benefits portable, or do we sort of ensure some sort of universal access? So this has been a lot. There's been a lot of theoretical framework discussion around this sort of portability versus universality, and that's already there in the architecture, because at least in theory, certain elements of India's social protection are so universal, with of course pragmatic access issues. But there are other parts which are not universal and require specific frameworks to make them portable. So we do need to figure this out, and how do we do that at the city level when these frameworks are not clear at the higher levels of center and state? Identity inclusion, the idea of localized identity and urban citizenship has been theorized a lot, especially in the context of the EU and sort of the migration crisis in the EU. And the question of political inclusion. So basically, who takes accountability for migrants and what motivates that accountability? And that needs to be answered in the case of cities, because clearly, up till now, they have been seen as in the labor framework alone. And not as citizens. And they are citizens constitutionally of the country. So how do we argue for a citizenship when labor is the only framework through which, not that labor itself should not be a framework which ensures certain rights and dignity, but we can't just have the framework stop at labor. It has to intersect with other things that comprise a dignified and adequate life. Just looking briefly at what the EU did and the concept of multi-level governance, and also situations where city governments actually did things and took on positions that were against their own national policies in order to accommodate, and so they took this pragmatic rights-based approach, because for years you've worked and you've sort of created a framework in which all your citizens get at least basic water, certain basic bundle of services, and now you have this new set of people coming in and they have nothing, and all of this did happen, which created a lot of different kinds of frameworks of how cities and nation states interact with each other. In India, we have a 3-tier framework, with the government of India taking certain set of so the constitution discussion is at the government of India level. The government of India decides how much money states get for various things, and what broad social protection policies should be. And then there's a whole bunch of decisions at state level. But what power really does the urban local body have to decide? What can cities do is the question that we keep coming back at, and that's sort of what's the disheartening question in urban studies in India all the time. But I'd like to make a point here about inclusive policy versus inclusive practice from my research. A lot of times, we in good intention, make recommendations for policy, but even when the policies are in place, there is active exclusion at the ground. So norms and imaginaries of local communities and public officials impact practice, and these norms and imaginaries may or may not have any factual basis. And again, this was seen, in the EU situation, and there's a lot of research on this. But I'd give you a few examples from Mangalore and Kishangarh. We try to track BOCW, so building and other construction workers' welfare. There's a dedicated fund for the welfare of construction workers in India. Most states actually have money sitting in this fund, and they haven't done a very good job of spending it. So we try to ask at the district level, why is it that, who are migrants registered? And we found clearly that in-state migrants tend to get registered, and they are registered through registration drives, which CSOs and NGOs are paid to conduct by the Labour Department. So they actually get some incentives, 10 rupees for every filled form or something or the other to do this. But even the CSOs and NGOs don't register interstate migrant workers, because and the reasons they gave us was that they are not going to stay here for very long. They don't need it because they're only here for 4 months. They're often just invisible and inaccessible because they're in labor camps. So there was a very low awareness among local officials, and neither does the Act have an explicit, it doesn't speak to this issue explicitly. So it's easy nobody can go and hold them accountable for this because it's not explicitly stated. So that's one example. The second was police perceptions related to migrants and crime. And this came up, Jeevan spoke about how many migrants face violence and discrimination and they don't report it. We interviewed police officials at various levels, and we found that the higher we went, the more the bias against migrants. And oftentimes, the bias against migrants came from their previous postings in other metropolitan contexts, which they're carrying with them and bringing to a district which actually has small cities and not large metros in it. So they have no understanding of that these things are also context specific, and you may have a gang or sort of large criminal gangs happening in a city like Bangalore or Mumbai, but the political economy of a Mangalore or a Kishangarh is not the same. So this kind of perception also immediately impacts housing. It impacts the feeling of safety. And the third example is urban planners whom I interviewed. And this is coming from sort of a grounded theory analysis, and was not a direct. I could not read this when I actually did my research. I read this 2 years later when I put all my data into the software and tried to see, code it and make links. And planners have anxieties over migrants because they are afraid of land encroachments. And when they say this, what they're actually saying is that local politicians settle migrant populations in order to create vote banks, and then it becomes the planners' problem. So it's laid at our door. Why did the slum come up? And then there's all of this politics about whether you should report a slum or not, because it then shows up in the statistics and all of that. So the planner was basically saying that it's not being able to have a solution for migrants and their housing that results in this issue. But at the same time, they were also characterizing the migrant as an encroacher. So this is what I mean by norms and imaginaries, where of course you do know the rational and logical side of it as a technocrat or a professional, but it's also caught up with your own norms which you've grown up with and which you've been socialized into. So this, of course, are some parameters for migrant incorporation and citizenship improvement, which is true for Europe, which is true for India. As the longer you stay, perhaps it's easier for you to sort of strengthen your social networks, etc. But this is exactly what then renders the seasonal and the short-term workers particularly vulnerable, because they're really not able to do this very effectively. Social integration, we also found, was much easier for people who belonged to the same caste as powerful elites, so they could actually shortcut a lot of the teething processes. They're also linked with spatial segregation. So cities are different from each other in the sense that cities that are already spatially segregated operate differently from cities that have a tolerance for more diversity or have a local culture of intermixing. So this plays out very differently too. So for instance, in Kishangarh, the migrants were spatially so segregated that they were not even referred to in the public life of the city or talked about. I mean, they were a non-entity, they were completely invisible. But in Mangalore, which is a very cosmopolitan city, migrants were much more visible and much more, you could see them in public life. And also because there is some level of organizing and unionizing that has happened, we also found that they were able to go to the labor office, at least informally, in small groups, with complaints, and with they were able to access the state in some way. So there's also sort of a diversity there. Keeping consistent IDs, I think this also Jeevan mentioned, and here I'd also even keeping IDs safe. If you live in a settlement that burns down, if you live in a settlement that gets evicted without notice, you may have the IDs and you may keep losing them. And this endless cycle of running after documentation, that creating it, losing it, running after it again is something that we've all seen, those of us who work on the ground here. Then, of course, there is this question of stable employment, so formalization and the benefits of formalization in being able to sort of make you visible and therefore give you a foothold into urban citizenship. But also the business of constantly the tax bogey that's being raised. And here I'm sort of stepping away a little bit from our frame of seasonal migrants or informal sector workers, but people like us, educated Indians who move from one city to the other, we buy our way into urban citizenship because we can make these contributions and we are tax-paying citizens, and that immediately then gives us a sort of a confidence to interact with the urban framework. So informalization also works against them in this way, and this is a structural problem. It's not their fault that it's this way, but then the structural divide actually continues to keep them in that precarious position. So just last two slides quickly, winding up and saying that, what can migrant-friendly cities do if they are permitted to, and if we can think in that direction. First, enumeration. We're starting with a national level database. Why can't we start with local databases, local registrations, bringing our local databases together, using databases that were actually created during COVID for ration relief. As Jeevan has said, many people have come back to whichever cities they left from. They may be 50% in some cities, 60, 70 in others, but there were those databases that were made by civil society organizations and the state, and often in collaboration with each other, to address those crises at that time. Why can't they be brought back into operation and vetted and validated and used now? Labor and employment, I won't say much about. I think Divya has already made a series of recommendations there. Social welfare, here again, the schemes are there, but connecting them on the ground has to be done by the city, by the local government, and there has to be a nodal agency within the local government to do it. So we need nodal agencies at every level, not just at the center, but at the state and at the ULB to deal with this. Otherwise, it is going to sort of slip between the cracks. The question of municipal services is, of course, linked with the issue of informal housing. So I won't say more on it, but we all know that this is a constant issue in the Indian context, and many have argued for municipal services to be delinked from the idea of formal tenure. But there's also then the issue of grievance redressal. So if I do have tankers going out from the municipal corporation to informal settlements, so I have sort of breached that barrier and created some sort of in-between system. Can I complain if I'm a migrant, if I'm a renter, if my landlord is an absentee landlord? How do I access the system of grievance redressal? Do I feel confident enough to do it? Is it accessible to me? Planning, I feel this is something that I think there's a lot of promise in. We've been doing some work here in Delhi, metropolitan context, but I think large cities do set certain sort of standards and practices as examples. Delhi's in the process of redoing its, getting a new master plan prepared, and so we've been working with a collective called Maybe Delhi. So I am also Delhi, which is a collective of informal sector workers, and trying to get their voices into the plan. And during the pandemic, the collective actually worked with street vending associations and representatives in markets in the eastern part of Delhi to make them COVID safe and convince the municipality to reopen the markets early so that livelihoods could be restored. So participative solutions, not just for enumeration, but actually to be put into city plans so that even these can actually be codified even in a spatial way and in a way that can respond to the livelihoods of migrants. And the last, of course, is the work what I work in, rental housing markets. So the pandemic has definitely, from a policy perspective, urged the Indian government to look at rental housing more seriously. But the solution they have proposed is a formal top-down kind of a solution, which is either revamping existing public housing that did not get occupied or asking the private sector to step in and construct new rental housing. But they haven't really done much to intervene in the rental markets that already exist, to create matchmaking systems, again, do participatory work in order to streamline those, because there are also pain points on the landlord side which need to be addressed. So there are opportunities here which South Africa and some other nations have taken on in terms of empowering small-scale landlords to actually become producers of better quality rental housing in cities, and especially for cities like Guwahati and Jalandhar and Kishangarh. These are solutions that are far more workable because private sector is not going to find it profitable to go in here and run rental housing. There's historically been very low returns on the rental housing market in India. So these are not pragmatic solutions. I'll go back sort of to just reiterate that all of this is a bit of a pipe dream right now because we don't have adequate centralization and very top-down governance frameworks. There is no national policy on migration, though we are making a nationalized database of quote-unquote blue-collar workers. But my hope is that these kind of local and neighborhood-level actions can continue, and they can continue under the radar of formal policy itself coming back to shape policy. So it's sort of a subaltern view of policy making that I'm taking here, and in the hope to provoke conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mukta. That was very, very interesting and very full, like the other two papers that have gone before. And thanks to all three of you, we've got a good amount of time for questions. I think one of the things that struck me listening to all these papers is just how difficult all of this is going to be to get sorted, because we're starting off with a set of people who, almost by definition, are already vulnerable. I mean, I work at the other end of the migration chain, if you like, in a village in Western UP, and people there endlessly say, why would we go if we had work locally? We don't want to leave our homes. So there's a huge economic pressure to leave, and apart from the sort of kinship networks that might help you settle in, you are very vulnerable to pickadars and all sorts en route. And then when you think about the other key parties who are involved in this, there's not a lot of clear interest that they might have in sorting these problems. Employers are probably delighted not to have to pay quite so much to their migrant workers and to keep them on these temporary contracts. Trade unions, unfortunately, worldwide seem to have a propensity for being a bit hostile to people coming from outside, particularly if they're seen as undercutting. And then you've got the police, which are often run too user-friendly for people who live in these sort of very marginalised communities. So I suppose one of the things I would wonder about is where do we insert into this sort of rather difficult set of actors some sort of capacity for making substantial changes, because I think we all know that the living conditions, the working conditions, the access to healthcare and all of these sorts of things are really very, very problematic. So I'm throwing out a pessimistic question there. Maybe somebody would like to pick it up. But meanwhile, we have quite a lot of questions in the chat. I don't know how many of you can see all of these. I don't know where to start. Hector, have you managed to consolidate these?
Yeah. Can I start with Mukta's question to Jeevan? Mukta, do you want to ask you the question directly about the correlation between migrants with families and duration of stay in the city?
Yeah, I mean, it was just what triggered the decision to bring the family. Was there a correlation between the duration of stay and what were the other factors? So because you sort of brought that up, I was curious what data exam.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think so much can be said about that as well. I think there is correlation from our data, duration and bringing families. And the main motivation for bringing the family was education, children. Especially, those who got their families. Of course, it did depend on the distance between their home and the city, for instance. So for those who had brought their children with them in, say, in Jalandhar, in Guwahati as well, those who got their families, education is what they spoke about, and they sent their kids to schools. We saw that. So I think that I would say that straight from our data on that question.
Thanks, Jeevan.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think maybe go to other questions. I think there was one question for me which I can come back to, but maybe take other questions.
So there's a question from Srishti on the access to healthcare, precarity and access to healthcare. So given this informality and this multi-locality, is it safe to assume that workers fail to access healthcare? Or is there any evidence from any of your studies or reports on access to healthcare?
Is Srishti still there? Does she want to add anything to that? I don't see her there. Sorry. So perhaps you can answer that question.
Hi. Am I audible?
Oh, hello. I couldn't find you. Yes, you are. Now.
Okay. Thank you. My question was fairly simple. Basically, I was thinking about women as migrant workers in the informal sector, and I was also thinking about what is the nature of access to healthcare for them, and it could definitely be very informal nature of healthcare, and if there has been any evidence of that. So just wanted to know more about that.
Thank you. Who wants to pick that up?
Can I say first? Can I go first?
Sure.
Yeah. we didn't really, I didn't really present on that, but this is one of the things we looked at in our study, and one thing that came out, quite obvious was access to healthcare when it comes to the sort of, for low-income migrants. What we saw was people going to private providers, so really market occupying the space, looking at these low-income migrants. But without any sort of, leverage, inability to put any pressure or on the, so the market, real market mechanism doesn't quite work. So you just go to a private provider when you're not well. We have, cases of migrant workers when they go to a government, hospital, being sort of ill-treated and turned down by that. And some of them have actually returned back to the village to receive, when you can't really get treatment done in the city, what you do is you basically rely on your family who will take that on, and you basically go to a health facility back in the village. So that is, in a very brief sort of that's what we've seen really, but it does depend. For instance, we did see in Jalandhar, when it came to HIV, migrant workers were very much in the lenses of the NGOs and the government, for that matter, because they were seen largely as potential spreaders of the disease. But for other sort of, we didn't really see anything in both of these cities.
Okay, Divya, or did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, just to sort of add to that, I think Jeevan has covered most of the points. One other constraint that we've seen in terms of migrants' access to healthcare is the timings of the public hospitals or primary health centers, for example. So it's usually from 10 to 5, and that is the same time as their work day. So they have to really forego a day's earnings or wages to be able to access the public healthcare system. So that's another reason why they go to the quacks. And of course, there's a lot of issue with respect to negotiating their entry and use of large sort of public hospitals. Language and signboards are also one important sort of obstacle, because they are not able to read signboards properly. It's in a regional language that they might not be able to understand, especially now during our work in Surat, where most of the signboards are in Gujarati, and a large proportion of migrant workers are Odia from Orissa. This has been cited as a major impediment. And yeah, they definitely go back to their more familiar pastures, that is the villages, where again they have to depend on suboptimal healthcare, because the public healthcare systems in the villages are not very robust. At the same time, like Jeevan said, in HIV, for example, migrants are recognized as a separate category that needs specialized interventions. But if, for example, in national programs that deal with tuberculosis, so in our intervention areas, for example, we've seen that the incidence of TB in migrant workers is almost about 8 times the national average, because they work in very precarious kind of work setting, congested work environments. They even work in congested work environments. But even then, the TB, the national framework or the health system that's been specially set up to provide treatment for tuberculosis, they don't regularly account again for the mobility of migrant workers. So we see a lot of instances where the treatment of tuberculosis acts in such a way that they start to feel better immediately once the treatment starts. But continuing with the treatment and not dropping out is very important for actual recovery. But because there are so many economic pressures on migrant workers, they just immediately go back to the labor market once they start feeling better, or they are going back to their villages. And there's almost always a discontinuation of treatment. And because the treatment network does not really account for this mobility and economic pressures, deterrence to TB treatment is very low. So that's another constraint that we see.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the whole DOTS program relies on people showing up every single day for whatever 6 to 9 months, and that is just incompatible with people's work. Yeah. There's a question here from Rika, which raises some quite sinister questions, I think, about whether she says one argument about the logic of urban governments is that it's intentional in not providing resources because there's a fear that migrants might settle in the city. Rika, are you still there? I haven't got everybody yet. Yeah, Rika's there somewhere. Can you unmute yourself, Rika?
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry, I mean, this was. Thank you everyone for the wonderful presentations. During the pandemic, and also with our work on migrant workers, we also hear about the deliberateness in terms of the lack of state action when it comes to providing housing facilities or registration for migrant workers when they move to cities. And one argument is that this is really deliberate because they I don't want to call it state, but there is some intention in allowing migrant workers to stay footloose and circular because this is also really preferred by the employers. And by employers, I mean sectors that are in global value chains where a lot of these migrant workers are employed, also in the economy. And because it's preferred by employers, there is no action to provide any kind of council registration or other facilities to migrant workers. So I want to know, if did Divya or Mukta, did they find any kind of did they hear about this argument when they during the course of their research? Did they come across? I'm not asking for any evidence as such, but this is usually always said, when we do our research, that there is a kind of intentional, deliberate lack of action on part of the state.
Can I start with? Can I start answering that?
Surely, yes. Go ahead.
One can't finish answering that particular question. but so I think this anxiety about there being the migrant overtaking the city and sort of inundating the city is definitely there, and it's not limited to India. It's sort of something that has built up as one of those urban myths or whatever the world over. That is why congestion and disease have been so strongly linked to migrant communities, and then gone and become these stigmas that have sort of stick to these communities. I think in the case of India, it is not weakly but quite centrally linked to urban, sort of our lack of imagination about the urban and our lack of just the ability to manage and manage the growth of cities. It's something that we've spectacularly failed at across this country, even in the best governed states of the country. Urban management and urban planning is a disaster area. And we seem to be constantly using infrastructure and new project development as the fix for problems that are actually, much more fundamental than that. So we cannot fix problems like land. We cannot fix problems like who's accountable for what, for interdepartmental coordination. So the anxiety is real, but at the same time, and I'll speak as an urban planner here, at the same time, when you have process of urban planning that no longer fit with the reality of how cities are growing right now, if you have 20-year or 10-year plans and no real incremental ways of fixing that, when you don't have any accountability for doing actual real-time surveys every time you plan a city. So for example, Delhi's 2021 master plan was made on top of the old one without doing an existing land use plan. So even at the moment of planning, what the data that you used was already horribly outdated and wrong. This time round, there's been a lot of noise about sort of doing that, also because now technology is available, and actually citizen groups can go and challenge, how are you starting with this as a starting point? Even the Google map can tell me that this is wrong. So now I think it's going to get interesting, because it's not going to be so easy for governments to get away with some of this stuff. But really, it's a huge lack of capacity. In addition to your arguments that you're making, which I'm not refuting. Yes, those vested interests do remain, but I'd just like to say that there is a genuine sort of lack of imagination of the city, a movement away towards privatization, which will never solve the problems of the most vulnerable. Why would a private actor come and build housing for somebody who can barely pay a few hundred rupees a month? So there are those gaps that have to be identified that the state will have to fill, and I think acknowledging that the state has to fill those gaps and making sort of governments acknowledge that has been one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. I mean, as researchers, as civil society, whatever our position may be, but when we work with migrants, that for me, that's the stumbling block, to constantly argue that there is this vulnerable segment for which some form of state intervention will be required. We seem to be going round and round in circles with that argument. Divya.
Thank you. Divya, did you want to say something here?
Yeah. I just one kind of piece of evidence that I want to add to what Mukta said. So we undertook a recent study in which we were trying to look at India's urban development policies and how they really look at migrants. So it was a very shocking, as I was going through the policy documents, especially the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, there was a shocking line in the PMAY document that said that the government authorities who are implementing PMAY should be wary of migrants, people migrating from rural areas just to be able to apply for units under PMAY. So that really that was a very shocking thing for me, because the idea that there is so much distress and rural impoverishment that is driving migration in India today, and the idea and this supposition or this assumption in the policy document itself that states that migrants would just come to the cities to be able to apply for subsidized housing units, and this whole, like Mukta said, this whole anxiety about leakage and how people, that of course is all pervasive in the Indian government system, and similarly it applies to migrants as well. But I think this line particularly shocked me, so I think that was just this one piece of evidence that I wanted to offer.
And the irony is that the affordable rental housing complexes scheme, which was sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the backlash, and the negative publicity that was generated during COVID, actually proposes to use vacant public housing. That public housing had exactly these kind of riders of domicile and of so many years of occupancy in the city. So at the time of construction of these wonderful projects, all these barriers were put in place to keep migrants out. And now that they're not occupied for obvious reasons, they're too far away, they're poorly constructed, a whole bunch of issues. Now that those discards, those failed projects are supposedly being repurposed for migrant workers who require to actually stay in the center of the city and, be most connected to the city's network and livelihood. So it's all this very garbled, the political imagination seems to bucket these categories and come at it with a very political lens and have these top-level solutions which cannot work on the ground, because the realities are far more complex.
Yeah, thank you very much. Did you want to say anything here?
To me?
Yeah, Jeevan.
I want to make a few comments if other questions are not there. I think on this very discussion we're just having, I think the question is, here we are researchers, generating new evidence, collecting new data, and so if the political, sort of the will or imagination, as Mukta says, isn't there, what's the point of having, data, then should we have faith in planning and evidence to bring about changes? Every time, if we can't even map the city land use properly, that's the basic when you start. So what are we all doing then? So I think that's sort of one provocative question, I guess. The second thing I want to say was about, I think it's pretty clear from, I think, what we've shared today is, believing in labor as a source of distribution, that, you employ people, you give people employment, all the talk around decent work, it's not really providing people with enough, salary or income to provide for themselves. So we have to talk about some form of distribution of, social protection or welfare. I think when we use the word welfare and social protection, we're dealing with low-income migrants with very little ability to demand. If you don't have that sort of political support to demand for services, it's going to be extremely difficult, despite having all these provisions and acts and so on. I think Mukta, you talked about having policies doesn't actually mean anything if we can't make it happen. And this is where the role of intermediaries like local governments or NGOs or activists, it seems we know from the work of Aajeevika Bureau, that seems to really make the politics of distribution work. So moving alongside politics of production, that is labor, going into the labor market. But that labor market is not really providing sufficient output to let you live. So you have to rely on some sort of. So that brings the question of, who are these people? I think that we discussed earlier. Are these laborers? Are these workers having some sort of labor rights? This is what we've been imagining. The cities, love migrant workers to come and work. Don't quite, love them politically, if I use that word. So they're, of course, they're labor beings or they're workers. They're also human beings. And we talked about, obviously we are discussing in the context of India largely internal migrants. If you're talking about cross-border migrants from Nepal or from Bangladesh, because they're also human beings, with certain human rights. So I think in terms of imagination, to talk about, whatever social protection and welfare, we have to have the labor rights hat, the human rights hat, as well as the sort of, the citizenship, the political citizenship hat together. Because, we are dealing with alleged or, imagined identities of people. For example, in Assam, we're dealing with, so-called Bangladeshi migrants. Just because you happen to be, Muslim from the bordering areas, you're imagined as a Bangladeshi. Therefore, the local perceptions as well as perceptions of local officials are quite hostile to these groups. It doesn't matter what is, who is who. I think what really matters is how people are being perceived in that sense. And I think what is really interesting, the other point I wanted to kind of, the last one is about, it's not the lack of evidence or lack of database. It seems there is so much data or enumeration that is out there, as Mukta says, but they are in different places, So what's the point of collecting information about low-income migrants in different ways, whether it's police or it's, whatever government departments, if it is of no use, So we are talking about, well, so why is the government or, is not quite able to mobilize? What kind of political imaginary do we need to make use of existing data to make it work? Yeah, take it as comments, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's a question from Radhika. Radhika, do you want to put it to the rest of the crowd, please? Yes, Radhika. Your voice is very faint.
Oh, my voice is faint. Can you hear me better now?
Just.
Full charge, so to speak, so I don't quite know why it's so big. Can you hear me now better?
We can, somewhat.
Somewhat, yes. It's not
able to make other questions.
Yeah, so there were just two questions. One is to Mukta. Part of the thing that we are doing with this project, in fact, is to address the issue of visibility and invisibility of migrants. And one of the ways that we are doing this is to actually produce a book based on photographs that we've collected through these 2 years in the field to argue that, the visual actually tells a story, which is a very important story about not just who are migrants, but what is the experience of migration and being a migrant in a city. And I think that when I sort of reflect on the photographs and reflect on many of the issues that have come up in our discussions, for example, the Guwahati material tells us that it's very interesting that we continuously speak about the invisibility of migrants in law, in policy, and so on. But it's also odd how, at particular moments of time, as Jeevan just mentioned, migrants are highly visible. But I think what the Guwahati material tells us is that migrants are simultaneously visible and invisible. And the same regime makes migrants visible for particular purposes, if you will, and makes them invisible for others. I mean, so there is a sense in which the migrant whom we've, so much of the literature pegs onto the economic zones of life is in fact a political figure. And we need to look at political theory itself in the way that they have unmapped the migrant. in political theory. So we've never really understood that the migrant is the person, the migrant presence is a very large one, politically speaking, because it's the migrant presence that also defines the limits of citizenship, the limits of rights, the limits of policy, and who is entitled or not. So it seems to me that this idea of visibility is something that we as researchers in the social science fields, and not as policy people, not as government people, really need to address what is the substance of this invisibility and so on. Similarly, with Mukta, I was really intrigued by the set of visuals that you showed us about this one locality that you have been plotting over a period of time. And one visual was this sort of suddenly this emergence of this single 8-story tower in the midst of what you call the shanty. And I think that actually it shows us something that is also emerging from the Jalandhar data, it seems to me, that it's when cities are in that process of transformation, and cities, I agree with you, Indian urban planners are a hopeless lot. But nevertheless, when cities are being planned and transformed, infrastructurally speaking, there are zones that are literally created as a kind of a kacha zone, you could say. And the kachaness refers not to the sort of materiality of the housing that is, present there, but also in terms of the kinds of, what should I say, the kachi abadis are really about the claims that people can make. Yeah. They're kacha claims. And these cities then, I mean, these zones of the cities, and Jalandhar's zoning and rezoning of Jalandhar has really produced this material very interestingly, is that we think of these zones as margins of the city. In fact, they're frontiers. And in some senses, this is where, and this is how the private capital and the expansion of the city will move, by first sending in these impermanent settlements, settlers who can be turned into migrants and migrants turned into settlers for periods of time. So there's this constant vacillation between the way that cities develop and are rezoned and the way in which people who habit those zones become migrants, are constantly being made migrants. So, when we say that in Jalandhar, there were so many who have been there for more than 10 years, etc. Well, that is from their own narratives. But actually, if you look at the structure of Jalandhar and its zoning of the industrial zones and the factory zones that have come up, you can see that the housing that has been provided is really based on what was the conversion of arable land or agrarian land into this rented accommodation, these new forms of accommodation made specifically for migrants, but they're kacha. So they can be at any time, they have no municipal entitlement or recognition either. So it's not just the migrant, but the landlord also, let's say, who is unrecognized in the registers. It's I think what this project has really done by focusing on these two smaller cities, well, they're not small cities, no, and they've all had, and both cities have had very long histories of migration. What they have, I think, shown us in the contemporary moment is how the migrant is to be seen both as a political figure, a figure who constitutes what is a set of rights. The migrant is a lens, if you will, through which we need to see the larger structures. So it's not only how larger structures access the migrant, but how migrants define what that larger structure is trying to do. So it's a kind of general comment.
Yes, we're nearing a time when we need to start wrapping up. So if you want to say something, say it quickly.
No, I just want to quickly respond saying that my work in Gurgaon actually shows that very well, because the city has a very particular history of having grown very fast in just 2 decades. And so all of this that's happened in Jalandhar is happening in this extremely fast-tracked way. And that's exactly what Sikandarpur, my site, shows, that it's constantly being made and remade. But the more interesting thing is that the landlord is also now moving out of these spaces and relinquishing the space to migrants. So there's an intermediate category of older migrants that is now beginning to control the political economy of these smaller neighborhoods, and also getting political identity in the process. So the anxiety is really, you can see it around local election time, and the access to the voter card, and these are the kind of conversations that are happening. So all these different categories of migrants also need to be read against each other, because it's not just the locals who are controlling migrants' lives, it's also older migrants. Many of the Tekadars are older migrants. So all these very interesting temporal and intergenerational relationships, but not just of the migrant, but also of the landlord, because the landlord is also moved from a very agrarian life to this extremely urban life in a very short period of time, and has had to make that social adjustment in just 1.5, 2 generations. So there is the struggle of them trying to move class from agrarian elite to urban elite, which is at the same time as this rural migrant is trying to become an urban political figure. So these are the transitions that are happening. And I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a political scientist, so I struggle with the theory part of it, but I can see it happening in these sites. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Radhika.
Really interesting. Thank you very much. Jeevan or Anuj or Radhika, do you want to provide any concluding comments? Because we're nearing the end of our formal time. I suspect we can drift over a bit, but I equally suspect that most people want to have a break. Jeevan, you're muted.
Yeah, I think I've said what I had to say. If there was apart from thanking all of us, Radhika or Anuj.
No, I mean, I really want to thank everyone and the excellent speakers. I think the only point I was wanting to make, but I don't think we have the time to, and I'm not going to elaborate at this, but perhaps at the next webinar that we're going to have, as a sequel of this one, on 8th March, is related to the also how healthcare and healthcare provisioning acts as another framing of that making and unmaking of migrants and of their rights and entitlements. And I think we were talking about TB and the DOTS program, but there was, what was also very interesting in the context of our study that we found is that by being targeted for HIV-related interventions, they did have access to a range of other healthcare provisions which otherwise they would not have access to, and how their relationship with the healthcare system got established through that particular framework. So I think it's far more layered and complex when we talk about how public health interfaces and programs shape the framework of rights and entitlements. But I'll end there. I just want to thank everyone for these excellent talks today. It's really fascinating to hear.
Yes. Can I just endorse that? Thank you very much indeed, particularly to our guests, Divya and Mukta, because I think their papers were very thought-provoking and very detailed, and I think we'll all take a lot of these ideas on board. There's a huge amount of discussion that we need to engage in, and I hope that some of you may be able to be available for the next webinar on March the 8th, which is going to have a particular focus on gender, but as we all know, gender is everywhere, and everywhere is in gender, so I'm sure our topic will not be constrainable into a tiny little corral. It'll spread out into a lot of these sort of issues that we've been talking about so far. So can I just say thanks very much to everybody who's come along. A lot of people have been there lurking in the background without so much as a picture of themselves. I have no idea what you look like, and you haven't contributed, but we haven't got the space to let everyone contribute equally in this limited amount of time. But I hope you've all got our access, our emails, and if there are any points or anything that you want to raise with us, any ideas that we might want to pursue, we'd be very grateful for whatever feedback you can give us, because this is still, although it's billed as a kind of dissemination event, we're still working on the data. Publications are still being drafted and written, and we're very much open to new ideas and new comments. So thank you very much, and I guess we just close down.